Hey, how's it going, my friend? So, I've been trying to finish this Kenneth Minogue book. I did 8 chapters, it worked. But then I realized that accountability, it's very hard to be quote unquote accountable when I have to, do it on my own. So I thought, why not record it and make it so I read it out loud with you guys? And I think it's a good idea. And I'm going to call this series Raw Reads. So raw reads. So I'm gonna raw because I'm filtered, and reads because I'm gonna read it out loud. So I might end up calling it reading out loud, ROL, but we'll see what happens. So I just really wanted to get it done. So let's just see what happens, guys, honestly. So chapter 8, the experience of politics, how to be an activist. Those who study politics are called political scientists, and we must presently consider politics as a science. First, however, we must look to what is it that scientists have to study, namely the actual experience of engaging in politics. This experience is sometimes compared to theater. Politicians and actors certainly belong to related tribes. Much of the architecture of public life recalls the classical inspiration of the Roman Forum, especially that of Washington. In London, the House of Parliament, rebuilt in the middle of the 19th century, has been appropriately described as classical structure with neo-Gothic detail. The architecture of the Kremlin and its communist embellishments reflect the remoteness and grandiosity of despotism. French public architecture is imperial in its grandeur. That British Prime Minister lives in a more or less ordinary house in more or less ordinary streets reveals something of the casualness of British life. And this is something very interesting because it's something I've been saying now that I've been studying French culture, le culture français, that I think that British and American culture to a lesser extent, there's a lot of modesty, and Canadian as well. This idea of modesty, and it's so important to understand this culture, casualness, modesty, that we need to look into it in much more depth in future videos. So this national theater of politics, but most political drama, even in the television age, takes place in the local and regional offices, in dusty halls and on windy street corners where electors can be harangued. Politics has its own logistics. It requires agents, premises, contacts with printers, a pool of supporters, money, and generally as a condition of all these things, the establishment of a political party. The rich and famous sometimes incline to start a party from scratch, but it is a difficult option. The typical route taken by the ambitious politician is the periphery, it resembles a game of snakes and ladders. That's an idiom, and I'm gonna... the politician needs, for the start, the same kind of knowledge as a concerned citizen, just more of it. What American politicians could move a step without a knowledge of the Constitution, Bill of Rights, and many decisions of the Supreme Court. Knowledge of history is indispensable, supplying a range of memories, references, and metaphors, without which political talk would be unintelligible. From the War of Independence through the Civil War to the very songs and slogans of the American past, the politician must be able to pick up the references, many of them highly local, which constitute the cultures of those who they seek to represent. He must know that Senate and Congress work in detail, not to mention in a way in which states relate to them. Much of this low-level, slightly tedious descriptive detail, but without it, the politician's understanding highly rises above gossip. Tradition of politics vary greatly. In the beginning, by contrasting politics with despotism, we have suggested there is an immense gulf dividing the possible ways of ordering society. The very idea of what a human being is, what is due to men, and especially to women, will in many countries be remote from what it is believed. by the average reader of this book. A tradition is something called handed down from one generation to another and perhaps redescribed as political culture. And here, guys, I don't agree, because like he's saying that he always tries to compare the quote unquote West, which I don't agree with other civilizations, and he's saying, okay, we have politics, they have despotism, and we'll compare it to, I don't want to say which countries, but to like less democratic countries. But I don't agree with that reading, but that's my observation. It's because I study Edward Said, and he talks a lot about Orientalism, and I feel there is a Orientalist undertone to many of these, like Minogue's ideas. So political culture must be the central way of understanding in any political system. It is composed of many strands, and what people say about the state may be given very little sense of the reality of politics. A population long accustomed to be exploited by tax collectors, for example, has an attitude to the census, to governmental forms, and a rhetoric of leaders quite different that which used to be in European liberal democracies. In some traditions, people are sanguine about what can be changed; in others, fatalistic and cynical. The very language in which thoughts and sentiments pass down over generation reveals a conceptual structure which affects political possibility. All languages have some analog for justice, for example, as fairness. On this broad theme, such as the idea of fairness, which can only be imported from other languages. Even European languages, which are culturally similar to the English, do not yield a genuine translation of the subtitle Justice as Fairness of John Rawls' A Theory of Justice. Again, the Chinese character for freedom connotes slipperiness and egoism rather than courage and independence with which Europeans associate the term. Most political knowledge generalizes experience. The politician cannot help but learn a great deal from the past, especially from exemplary heroes and villains. Machiavelli recommended a close attention to the great deeds of Rome, but modern history is not without its fertile ground, and certainly more revealing must know something about the Magna Carta, Roundhead and Cavalier, Whig and Tory, and the reform bills of the 19th century. Reading. So, how to extend the screen. So most political knowledge generalizes experience. The politician cannot help but learn a great deal from the past, and especially from exemplary heroes and villains. Machiavelli recommended a close attention to the great deeds of ancient Rome, but modern history is not with less fertile in suggestive examples, and certainly much more revealing about our own political tradition. A British politician, for example, must know something about the Magna Carta, Roundhead and Cavalier, Whig and Tory, the reform bills of the 19th century, the contrasting political styles of prime ministers such as Melbourne, Pell, Disraeli, Gladstone, Churchill, Attlee, Wilson, not to mention the events of the 20th century. Much of this will be legend, and what is heroic to some will be deplorable to others. A Labour politician might regard Ramsay MacDonald's formation of the national government in 1931 as an act of treason to the party. A Conservative would treat the event quite differently and would certainly see it as less important. Political trains for the real world by endless talk about past landmarks and present possibilities, and they do so in a special language of their own. Thus, appeasement is no longer in politics a name of the type of response to someone's discontent, but refers to the dispute about foreign policy in the 1930s. For several decades after the Second World War, it denoted an episode of shame and cowardice. Then came revisionism, an attack on the reputation of Churchill, the great critic of appeasement. Wonky the first time, but it's gonna get better and better. As I do more of these readings. And the argument that Britain alone stand against Hitler in the 1940s had merely deliver her into the hands of the rising empires of the US and the USSR, it is very seldom that events stand still for long, and the paradox is that in the past, nearly as opaque as the future, for an aspiring politician in a country such as France, the past hangs more heavily than is common has in Anglo-Saxon countries. Thank you, Kenneth Minogue, finally acknowledging the Anglo-Saxon term. I've been talking about this a lot, and I feel like it's fitting. Like, c'est un très bon mot pour décrire le pays anglo-saxon. The French Revolution split France profoundly, largely along religious and secular lines, and the occupation left memories which determined political allegiances for the rest of the country. Irish politicians have been similarly haunted by memory. The United States in general been more fortunate, though the legacy of the Civil War has been bitter. And then we're gonna see how the current age as well, we see the US divisions, which are similar along similar lines to the Civil War. But more now in between like liberals and conservatives. So since political skill requires wit, and politicians are remembered for phrases. Winston Churchill is remembered both for the speeches which articulated the lion's roar during the Second World War and for a string of witticisms, some of them malicious, like his description of Clement Attlee as a sheep in sheep's clothing. Lincoln's political successes came from Winston, but it's hard to imagine his political skill without his dazzling capacity for oratory. These men all belong, of course, to a vanished time when citizens attended like connoisseurs to long and complicated political speeches. Gladstone once took 4 hours to introduce his budget to the House of Commons, fortified it said with raw eggs and sherry. That culture has been destroyed by the trivializing effect of radio and television, which provides such abundant instruction for the mind that politics must be fitted into much smaller space, the soundbite. And this is very, very interesting. I've never thought like this, it came from this trivialization. It's so important, guys, and we're going to be talking about it in the future. The soundbite belongs to the simplified world of slogans and banners, but this does not diminish the need of the politician for the phrase maker. In modern democracy, a politician is a spokesman for some broadly based opinion, and what he or she hopes to become is a holder of office. Spokesmanship and office are polarities within which the men and women go into politics must live, and it reveals much about politics. Spokesmanship is representation. So now I'm going to pause right now and see. It must be conducted by representatives rather than by citizens themselves, because legislative enactments, often some hundreds of pages long, are too complicated to be mastered without unusual skill and attention. But the representative function of the politician begins long before politics emerge. It is the skill of constructing a position which will appeal to many people because it can harmonize conflicting desires. The superficial critic of politicians can see the vagueness and intermittency which are certainly often necessary for this, but generally fails to appreciate the trick of finding some essence of an issue that can unite different options. A skillful politician resembles a magician in his capacity to set an object before the mind of one audience, while keeping it invisible to others, sometimes in the same hall. Simple-minded rationalists sometimes stigmatize this characteristic of politicians as nothing but support-seeking duplicity. And journalists have taken decoding their speeches and disclosing the supposed message behind the words. Better understood, this technique is that which allows people with very different judgments and preferences to live in one society where it fails. As for example, in a difficulty Canadian politicians have that projecting a Canada that will accommodate Francophone and Anglophone opinion, then society moves to the brink of the solution. American politicians finessed the division over slavery for as long as they could, for they suspected that a real alternative was civil war, and they were right. Constrained by this representative function, the politician is further circumscribed by responsibilities to his office. The raw brutalities of power are largely converted into the suavities of authority, and it is important to distinguish between these two phenomena. Okay, Thank you very much, my friends. Let's continue in the next video. Honestly, I think I'm learning much more by reading aloud. See you in the next episode.